Ready Player Will.
Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today we have the Squall review from Final Fantasy VIII. Hopefully I have some good news here today for those of you who have pulled him and are looking to find some optimal ways to use him. So let's not waste any more time, we'll get into it. Today's character review, the typical character overview, base and total stat analysis, whole bunch of other stats leading up to the report card. We'll then grade some of those stats in the context of his kit. We'll look at some general thoughts here to kind of bring things together as we transition to the passives, the counters, the job abilities, the AI priority. We're going to talk about the Honeycomb unique mechanic that they've given him, as well as what I think is to be a global improvement in how I'm personally going to be building him, but I have some ideas that I don't think I've seen stress tested enough. Then the TMR review, the job-based vision card eligibility, Esper Synergies, and weapon optimization. So, kicking things off, Squall, the brand new lightning unit added here to Global. They've given him the Seed unique main job, Trick Lancer, and Pugilist subjobs. He does equip swords as a sword knight unit in that category, equips hats, cloths, and accessories with a move of 3, jump of 1 as a 100 cost unit. Now the Faith recommendation, absolutely at 50. I see no reason why you'd ever go higher than that. And when we look at the aspects of the job here, he's got a max range of 5 squares away. That's really on a big diamond AoE. He's got 2 AoE type abilities and 2 unit attack abilities. From a resistance standpoint, strong double digits of 20% to both slash and strike, 10% to missile, 5% to magic, with the minus 10% being to pierce. That's obviously kind of a recurring trend we've seen in many characters lately. In terms of ailments, you do have 50% both to blind and stun, relatively commonly, or at least potentially commonly used ones. 10% to berserk, also underratedly very nice. We look at the mastery ability, they gave them the HP and the lightning attack that they normally do, 20 innate reaction block rate, and 10 AoE res. With the dream ability, you do get a decrease of AP consumption of 20% to all skills within the kit, and 15 lightning attack as well, which will apply to every single attack in his kit because they are all lightning type attacks. Now, as we look into the base stats here, now base HP is actually very, very strong, and surprisingly for most of these charts, I just did my Grifford review, Squall's almost identical in many regards to how tanky Grifford was, so the offensive ability, some of those other stats, so I really didn't have to change much, to be honest, but the HP is exceptionally strong here for a damage dealer, very common for what we're seeing for those physical melee units post 3rd anniversary. From a base attack perspective, also very, very strong here, sitting amongst some of the higher ones here at the top of the chart. From a agility perspective, actually pretty high here for base agility. And I know the base agility typically isn't a big indicator of what their final agility will be. Usually the board stats and the passives have more to do with that. But I am optimistic that the future Melnia vision card that is coming is technically an 18% agility. So those extra few percentage points on someone with a slightly higher base agility actually is kind of a nice thing. I don't think it's game changing, but this is a nice thing to see. Now, from a dexterity perspective, also skews relatively high here. He's not a crit monster by any means. He does need some emphasis on it, but the critical rate thing is something I'm going to come back to repeatedly in this presentation. This dexterity stat is a good one to start off with, and the luck is relatively average to below average. Doesn't really affect a whole lot in his kit at the end of the day. Now, as we look at the total stats here, kind of transitioning those 5 charts into one in terms of relative strengths and weaknesses. Again, I wouldn't say there's any here that stick out as necessarily a starting weakness, and that's one of the strengths of him, is that the base stats are overall very, very healthy, and even the total stats, when we incorporate the mastery ability, the board notes, things of that nature. I'm real sorry, quick edit, that was the wrong chart here. This is the corrected chart. Again, very, very strong overall from total stats. He does take a step back on the HP where this doesn't get any of the nodes to kind of keep up with the base, but overall the attack stats very healthy, the agility is very strong, dexterity and luck are in a good spot, and if you're looking at the sources of many of those stats, you can see they kind of overemphasize the attack node here for him. 10 agility is certainly nice. That's on the higher end of what they normally hand out for board-based agility. And the dexterity and luck stat are honestly pretty decent, both in their own respects. So as we look at the rest of these now, he does have 81 agility all said and done, with no passives to increase it. So when you compare him to other units without agility passives, he is amongst the higher side of things. Even when you do start including them, 81 is still at the UR average. I think that's why they gave him the unique agility buff on the vision card coming here to Global that came out this week, because they did want to give him just a little bit of an edge. Now, I don't love that vision card. We'll talk about why later. But for now, agility, not in the worst spot overall. The crit hit rate, he does start off on the relatively slightly lower side here. He does not have any critical hit board nodes, which I was kind of sad to see. But the one thing to keep in mind is that his passive from the Trick Lancer sub, that's the 40 defense pen, and that's something you'll typically almost always have on, also has 25 crit rate on. And so realistically, when you are having that passive compared to most other units, he does actually end up much higher on this crit rate gradient because of it. So there is some good upside here to lean in that crit rate, which I do recommend that you will. We'll talk about that more in my global improvement section. The critical avoidance rate, relatively average, nothing really to say here. Totally fine. Now, from an accuracy perspective, basically average for a base accuracy. He does have a passive that gives him 25, but I'll be honest, I don't think you're really going to have any opportunities to equip that passive. So it's a little misleading here to see that he is in this, like, you know, slightly lower tier of accurate units, when realistically speaking, I don't think he's ever going to be nearly that accurate, but he does have a guaranteed hit. That's an exceptionally good guaranteed hit, so there's at least that saving grace. Now, from an evasion perspective, very bottom of the gradient here, he is not an evade unit in my opinion. Don't even go for it. Lightning as an element is not good for evasion either. Just move on. Now, when we look at the report card overall, effective HP, again, very, very strong. B+ overall, in my opinion. His health pool is very strong. The resists are okay. The minus 10% to pierce does hurt him, but overall, he's got 14 defense, 0 spirit innately. He's got 25 AoE res when you consider it's 10 innately and 15 from a passive that you'll have on all the time. He does have no unit resistance innately, though, which is kind of a red flag given the current shift in the meta. But he has, and we talk about this right now, from a survivability perspective, a bunch of unique things to kind of help with that. I'm going with a B+ in the survivability, where he has this new mechanic. We call it the Honeycomb, and it's a form of damage reduction based upon how far away your enemies are that has some really cool implications, particularly from an AI perspective. But he is protect capable. His counter ability is also very strong for anti-slash and anti-strike. He does also get 15 defense upon critical hit on his weapon that does stack with other buffs. So he does get very, very high in his defense stat, and one of his main AoE abilities is a defense pen reduction on all enemies. So he'll not only be gaining a lot of defense, but he'll be reducing the enemy's ability to penetrate it. Very similar to Summer Glaciello, who we just saw, who has a near identical mechanic in that regard. Overall, survivability, very good for anti-physical damage, at least. The magic is fair. That Honeycomb Barrier does apply to magic, just not as potently. But overall, this is part of his build. A lot of people like to think of him as a brawler or a bruiser. I personally don't. We'll again talk about more why. I'm kind of teasing that. The damage, I am going with an A here, though. I know a lot of people were underwhelmed by his damage so far, but Global has the unique vision card of Esther's vision card that, you know, limited to global exclusive. It's a 35 slash res pen, which greatly amplifies his damage potential. He's got great attack stat overall, huge defense pen value that he can get up to 100 defense pen on his, you know, tank busting ability in particular. Big slash res pen upside. I don't think damage is as big of a concern here as many people think it is. The agility, I am going with a C+ here. He's at that 81 versus the 77 average. When you include characters that can equip passives, he's just at their average. So I'm kind of rounding up here, because he does skew just a hair above many others. The accuracy, going with a C+ as well. You know, average accuracy, the passive does bump him up, but it's really not practical to use it. He does have a 100% guaranteed hit, though, so that grade obviously doesn't mean as much when you have a guaranteed hit to use, theoretically. It just depends on how you interact with characters that have nullify sure hit, obviously, but that's a different story. The evasion, going with a C- possible, but not practical. And the movement, going with a D here. There's no movement capabilities. He does technically have a shift ability in his main sub-job, but I don't really consider that a real movement part of the grade here. The auto ease of use, I'm going with a B, though. A very straightforward overall kit. He can easily do the damage that he wants to. I really think it's the main buff, that priority that does potentially repeat, that anytime you have a buff that's a teammate buff that you might run in circles with, you need a little bit of a higher strategy to ensure that doesn't happen, and really make sure that you get the Honeycomb buff off, which is the second priority. That's the big thing that you need to do. So I can see people having some trouble with that, which is why I kind of downgrade him a bit here. But otherwise, it's very straightforward, does the damage pretty easily. His utility that he gives is pretty easy to take advantage of. Now, the game disruption, I'm going with a C here. Basically kind of whatever, it's average. You know, it's really mostly because many will pull for him, just out of favoritism, being a very popular Final Fantasy unit. He does actually have some very good anti-strike upside, which is the current meta that we are seeing. But overall, he does pale significantly in comparison to the, we'll say, top meta units. So characters like Bridal Elia, characters like Soul, who's about to be coming out here. Even prior to him, Bradley is on a different level than what Squall is, but Squall is still a very good character, just not a big game disruptor, if that makes sense. And the passive abilities, going with a C+ here. Here's the problem. Great passives, but I really think he's handcuffed to 2. I don't think we have really any flexibility to go outside of that, and we'll see that in just a couple slides here. The counter abilities, going with an A- here, great anti-slash and anti-strike counter, which do have, you know, a bunch of top meta units. As the game ages, we'll see how strong that ends up being, but for now, that is a very good thing. The overall job and kit, going with a B+ here. The buffs are fine enough. That's really one of his weaknesses, in my opinion, but he's got good attack versatility, you know, balanced in terms of range, AoE, utility. His sub-jobs are both strike and pierce access, so you have a couple different attack types. He's got a typeless attack on his main sub-job, so overall, I'm pretty happy with it. But the final grade, I am going with a B here. You know, there are some underwhelming things that we typically look for in terms of either having courage or re-raise, or more importantly, is the removal of courage or re-raise. We also look for things like movement altering passives. I look for things like agility altering passives, because those things like being able to change movement and agility makes for a lot of different team compositions and turn orders and whatnot, and you're kind of handcuffed when you don't have that. I will say, I think he's better than people meme on him for in terms of what's kind of been teased. I do think he will likely have some future upside with some more job-based vision cards, which is a big demerit at the moment, where he really is kind of confined to mono lightning teams because the sword knight category really isn't fleshed out from a job-based vision card perspective. So that's kind of a big demerit compared to many other characters in this, you know, stage of the game. So now for the general thoughts, you know, great penetration and damage tools. He can have up to permanently 85 slash res pen. That's his passive, the Esper vision card, and a Trust Stone passive. 85 slash res pen is pretty amazing for permanent 100% uptime. Most characters don't get anywhere near that. You know, Sephiroth and Bradley both can get up to that 100% slash res pen, but it's typically only after using an ability, and so it wears off after 3 turns. It can be dispelled. The bottom line is this is a very strong thing for him, and that vision card is very, very important. He does have a minimum 50 defense pen from his other passive, and a Trust Stone passive, so at minimum 50 defense pen. His Blasting Zone ability, which is 120, will get him up to 100 defense pen on that attack, and theoretically you have Dark Ifrit, that vision card, to play with that. You could get 25 extra defense pen if it's the main slot. Not common, but in the sub slot, that's still another 13 defense pen. It's still pretty decent overall. And then you do have a 38% slash imperil AoE. Now this AoE isn't as good as it might have been a year or two ago when you saw Gilgamesh, that big Kotetsu. A lot of slash res levels have kind of elevated in that time period, and just because of the current meta between Sephiroth and Bradley and how many of these strong slash units came out, a lot of people do still have them, so that 38% won't make as many people go negative as it used to, but that's still a really good thing for making sure he does the damage that he wants to do. And the Ragnarok Trials of Reckoning item, very important, is an extra 20% physical damage for him, so a nice big buff there that we've seen the Genji Glove be really impactful. It's kind of the same idea. This is more than the Genji Glove, actually. Genji's only 10%. Now, exceptional AP management. This is another great thing about him, that he really can just kind of go out and spam attacks, where he's got 20% decrease AP consumption on all abilities. He's got 10% AP restore on his limit break, so it'll function like Zizabel's to generate some AP. The Seed buff, which is his teammate buff, and I don't love this one, but theoretically this buff does give you 36 AP upon usage. It's a very, very high amount. And his lower AP ability is restore 10 AP upon critical hit. So overall, AP management is very, very strong for that damage uptime. He does also have great physical survivability, as I alluded to. The Honeycomb is a legit damage reduction mechanic. He is protect capable, and he's got very high defense potential alongside that defense pen reduction that he can AoE on enemies. So those things in conjunction do work very, very well. Now, he does have good sub-job versatility with the damage types. I mentioned you have Pierce and Strike options. He's a great new Lightning PvE min-max unit. Now, for those of you that are just kind of casual, he might not change a lot of things for you, but those that love to really, you know, strive for the high scores in guild raids and things of that nature, the Renzo Kukin ability does have a chain damage buff where it imperils the amount of chain damage someone takes from you. So theoretically speaking, you should on average do more chain damage. And his 4-hit limit break is the highest multi-hit in all of the lightning elements. So those two things do bode well for future usage. The critical hit game, in my opinion, is big for Squall, particularly when you talk about these chains, where I won't get into the math at this time, but crit damage is a major factor in chaining, where the modifier applies to every single hit on the chain. It's very unique in that regard, and lightning as an element historically has skewed very strong in its crit hit potential. We'll talk about that more in my global section, which is more toward the end. The Sword Knight vision card, as I talked about, has things left to be desired, but the current framework of what's offered does fit Squall. We'll talk about that in a couple slides too, where the vision cards that do exist currently aren't the worst ones for him in the future. The Ragnarok Trials of Reckoning item is a must for him, in my opinion, though. Not only does that enhance his Honeycomb Barrier, but it is that damage amplification, as well as some extra resistance. The other thing, too, the Honeycomb makes for some very intriguing enemy movement. Again, we'll cover this in the ability section, just a couple slides. And an honest reminder to stick around for my personal build thoughts later. Now for the passive abilities, these are good ones. You're just limited to both of these, in my opinion. Quetzalcoatl's Fury, it's defensive 12, 15 AoE res, and 40 slash res pen. That's a must for that slash res pen. Now, Trick Lancer lore is that crit rate of 25 I talked about earlier, and the defense pen of 40. You really can't change out of these and give up either one of those penetrations, which is kind of unfortunate. You have two different accuracy passives here that theoretically could bump him to the top of the charts, but that's what he has the 100% hit for. That's totally fine. So these are good passives, but I really do think you're limited to those two. I don't see many cases where you could possibly change that out. Now for the counter abilities, Auto Guard is a very good one, where it's that 70% chance to proc on slash and strike type damage, and when it does proc, it's a 40% damage reduction in addition to what the Honeycomb already provides for damage reduction. Outside of that, Counter Trick and Flurry Counter are fine. They're nothing really special in my opinion, but Auto Guard is a very good one for what has been the meta essentially since 3rd anniversary. Now for the main job buffs, one thing to mention is, from what I can tell in my testing so far, he does prioritize TMR first, which is a little unique compared to many other characters that have come out as of late, where they typically have a ability on their job that they prefer first. But in the limited testing I did, TMR did seem to be the priority, which I actually like a lot, if only because I don't think the Siege style combat is an amazing buff. I think you could probably get equal, if not better, returns on using a teammate TMR buff. For instance, Squall's TMR that we'll talk about later. But his first priority seems to be TMR. Second priority is Siege style combat. That's the defense of 20, slash attack of 25, protect of 25%, and this is where you get that AP bump of 20, and technically at minimum you get 16 AP from that usage, so 36 AP altogether. The Force Barrier is really the primary buff to focus on, though, where that's the slash and strike res of 25% and applies the Honeycomb buff. Now, I'm sure all of you are probably sick of me saying this without knowing exactly what the heck a Honeycomb buff is, and full credit to JB79 for this infographic. This sums it up way better than I possibly could. But the way the Honeycomb Barrier is that it reduces damage depending upon how far the enemy is from you square-wise. And so, just if you want to focus on this top left for a moment, the way this works is if you are 4 squares away, it reduces all damage, that's both physical and magical, by 10%. If the enemy's 5 squares away, it reduces it by 20%. 6 squares away is 30%, and then 7 squares or further is 40% damage reduction. Now this by itself I love a lot. If you consider how strong 10% or 20% damage reduction is, just for context, those of you that use the HP Trust Stones, that's the 5% all element res, well this is better than that because this is applied at the very end of the equation. That element res still doesn't take into account the future bravery mod in the damage equation. This is just at the very end a flat percentage reduction. This is one of the strongest. It's essentially like a perma protect in many regards too. Like if you think of protect being on, it's a 25% damage reduction at the end. This is the same concept. Now the thing about the Ragnarok Trials of Reckoning item that I alluded to earlier, this enhances the Honeycomb buff, but it's for physical damage only in its enhancements. That at range 3 it adds 10%, which is a increase because it's range 3 is not on the base ability, so you get extra resistance to those very close enemies. Range 4 it adds 20%. And range 5, it adds an extra 30%. So when we add up both of those for physical damage, This bottom chart is really one where you want to emphasize, where enemies that are 3 squares away, it's 10% less damage. Enemies that are 4 squares away, it's 30% less damage. 5 squares away is damage literally cut in half. And this is stronger than a barrier, in my opinion. Now, it does wear off after 3 turns, but barriers are breakable. This is not breakable. This is not dispellable. So you have a guaranteed damage mitigation amount for those 3 turns that it's used. So I do love this buff for his survivability, and it's a big part of my proposed buff for him in a couple sides once we've finished all of this up. Finally, the last interesting thing about the Honeycomb Barrier is how you consider how it affects enemy movement. Now, characters will always seek to maximize their damage output. And so if Squall blocks damage the further you are away, he is going to force the enemy AI to walk as close as possible to do the maximum damage. What that means is he will naturally, as people move toward him, funnel them closer and closer than they might normally be so that they can maximize their damage. That does include units like missile units who might normally stand still and snipe you from afar. If they can do more damage to him by being closer, they're going to put themselves in harm's way by being closer. And so when you talk about, we'll see in a couple slides here, his giant AoE slash imperil, if you're making enemies walk toward you closer and grouping to minimize the distance, you're going to more easily line up some of those close range AoE abilities on them, which is very, very cool from an AI perspective. But now when we look at the main job offensive abilities, you have to recall all of these are reduced by 20% because of his 140 ability. Energy trigger here is a nice 4 range ability, costs only 12 AP. This is where upon critical hit, you'll regen 10 AP immediately, and you'll gain another 15 AP if you kill an enemy. So this is a great ability, obviously, for ending a fight quickly if you can kind of secure a kill. The second ability here is Renzokuken. This is another unit type attack, only 3 squares away. The ability effect on this, I won't go terribly in depth in it, but it basically imperils the enemy's chain res so that it kind of does something small to the modifier. It's not an enormous damage increase. You will probably not notice it in PvP, but for PvE, when you are getting those significantly higher chains, this is a double hit that will be very, very good in maximizing his damage, more so than other chainers normally would. Now, Winding Blade is probably one of the best abilities here. This is that 38% very large AoE imperil in that diamond shape. It's also a decreased healing power of 50 for people in there, and decreased defense pen of 30 for those units in there. So again, Squall's going to get some very, very high defense values, and he's going to be able to reduce how much of that they can penetrate by this very all-encompassing AoE. And finally, this Blasting Zone ability is technically another AoE ability, but it's only in a straight line in front of him. It will Dispel Protect. It's increased defense pen of 50 for that attack. So again, that's where I get that 100 defense pen on this ability is exceptionally good. It's also his guaranteed hit chance for that 200% modifier. For 24 AP, this is a pretty darn good ability. It's just slightly unfortunate that it's technically an AoE, because obviously a lot of tanks skew a little higher in AoE res, but that's not necessarily true. I know like Glaciel and Alphonse technically are more unit oriented, but overall this is a very, very good ability. I level 4 these abilities on the job. But Renzokuken I would probably shy away from for PvP content, because specifically on the sub job that we'll talk about soon, I like something better. But the Leonhart Limit Burst is a very, very good one here, where that's his AP auto restore, only 40 AP. It's a quadruple hit here. It's 4 squares away, so technically Squall's rotation would more than likely be Winding Blade to start to get that giant AoE imperil, and then he'll follow up on them with this limit break after they've had their slash res decrease. So this could be a big gangbuster limit break for some. I love the AP restore for potential second Guild War fights, where you'll kind of get that bank of AP in fight 1 and be able to carry some of it over for fight 2, particularly if you're ending the fight with energy trigger, which will help regain some of that AP. So again, great AP management overall. This is the subjob that I was talking about a second ago. I love the Rough Divide ability here. For 20 AP, I'm sorry, that's even less. That's 16 AP. I didn't put the values here, but this is that shift ability I was talking about, where it moves him to target panel. It's decreased CT of 15% to the target, and it restores an immediate 200 to Squall. That's exactly what happens to King Bradley and many of his attacks. So when you talk about, looking at Renzokuken here, which is a similar ability, 3 squares away, it's only 18 AP, and then you can compare that to Rough Divide. I would rather turn off Renzokuken and keep this on and let him spam this. And I'm going to start saying this a lot more. Those of you that have watched my last review with Grifford, There's technically some AI manipulation you can do too by not fully leveling some of these abilities. Now, for those of you that are PvP oriented, I would recommend keeping Renzokuken at level 12 or 13 when you level the ability up. That way it does not get to the full 165% mod. The reason for that is he will prioritize Rough Divide instead, which is technically will be a higher mod, so you can force the AI to use this because it'll technically be more damage. Once this runs out after 3 casts, then he'll use Renzokuken the rest of the fight, but I like this a lot to start. Now, the only downside for those of you that are PvE oriented, obviously that completely kills the benefit of Renzokuken with that chain imperil on the enemy. So you have a judgment call there and how you want to potentially do that, should you like this ability. But getting on to Fated Circle, this is a typeless damage attack that's technically another AoE ability. And so when we talk about Squall just doing the damage he wants to do, this is a nice one that if an enemy has very high slash res, not that he's really worried, he has got 85% penetration, it's nice that you have this typeless attack. Now the Trick Lancer one, this is still a great sub job from the perspective that he's got the barrier break here, which we have not seen in the main job. I like this a lot, but this is a very, very short range ability overall that, although the physical barrier break is nice, it's not going to be early on in the fight. But I love the fact that he has access to this. I don't like the all-out assault buff. This isn't one that we've ever really used. But the rest of these abilities, leaning into that pierce weakness that many have is certainly nice. It's a great alternative to that main job. And finally, the Pugila sub-job here. This is a little oversaturated at the moment with the amount of strike res that we're seeing, so I don't love this sub-job anymore at the moment, but still, you talk about having access to 3 damage types, it's certainly nice that you have this as well. Now, this is the section I want to talk about with the quote-unquote global improvement. One of my fears, and one of the things I think of when people think of Squall as a brawler, is that they lean a little too heavily into that aspect of things. So they bulk him up a little too much and don't give him the respect he deserves for some of his potential offensive output. And just kind of recapping here, Esther's vision card is that 35 slash res pad, and this will be in the main vision card slot because it's also the 20 unit res for lightning units. This is already a great offensive enabler that JP doesn't have. And the second thing where we differ from JP is the Ibarra vision card, which when given to a magic user in your party, there's dexterity of 35% here, which greatly increases his crit rate further. Now, one of the reasons why I say that I think people might be potentially building him too brawly is I just want to revisit Force Barrier here for a second. You know how when you equip an Esper on a character, you might look for something like 25% element res, and it's a big part of survivability that you reduce enemy damage by 25%. Well, the fact that he's got the Honeycomb Barrier here means you can realistically forego those Esper nodes. You have this block that damage instead, and Squall will take, roughly the same amount of damage as every other character potentially would. What that leaves opportunities for is that in building your Espers, you can likely do away with some of the resistances you're used to having. So if you figure, I'm going to actually skip ahead here for a second. An Esper like Dark Bahamut, which is one of my recommendations, doesn't really have any good resistances on the board. It's attack percent, it's human killer, but you do also have slash attack and crit damage as well. And so while normally you might go for an Esper that has element res, you could probably go for Dark Bahamut instead, but it's way more offensive oriented because Squall roughly has that resistance built in innately. But just kind of going back to the vision cards here for a second, the dexterity of 35%, I also think not enough people are leaning into the potential crit of Squall, where this does amplify that rate greatly. That's a major extra damage output when you consider the extra modifiers. Lightning does have a fair amount of extra crit damage options as well, just for vision cards and teammate abilities and whatnot. That I think if you really put fuel on the fire on Squall's offensive capabilities, he's still going to a lot of people that you're probably not ready for, with really barriers being the only way to mitigate that damage. But then again, Alphonse, who maybe in your party does technically have barrier break on his main spammable ability, and Squall is in the Sword Knight category, which we'll talk about soon. And in that Sword Knight category is King Bradley and Winged Stern, who do have some good barrier breaking capabilities. So all's not lost in that regard. I think Global is likely going to see a much improved Squall than what JP did. I don't think you're necessarily going to see him everywhere when we get Soul with that little magic insurgence, but against Alaya, I see no reason why Squall wouldn't be able to do well in this current meta alongside the other strike units she's typically paired with, like Ed, heck, even Urel, Alphonse, all those characters. But now let's look at the TMR review. I do like this TMR as an accessory. This is a nice healthy defense stat of 13. It's got 10 crit rate as well if you wanted to go crit rate Trust Stones on the right side, which honestly not the worst idea. He's one of the few characters where I might recommend it here. But the TMR skill is very, very good from that. Yes, it's another haste TMR ability, but it's a teammate buff, so it's not one of these TMRs where you haste yourself and walk forward. It's very intentionally a horizontal-based movement, so I do like this TMR for even someone like Squall, where his turn 1, he'll move to a teammate, defense debuff revs of 100% for 3 turns, and grant haste to himself, as opposed to one of the others where he would haste and walk straight forward. This is overall a really nice chess piece to throw into what we have already existing for haste-based TMRs. This is a big, big, big thumbs up. Now for the job-based vision cards. Yeah, Sword Knight is not really in the greatest place at this time. In the future, we will be getting the Melnia vision card, which is a majorly good vision card for this class. It might be one of the best cards in the game. And once they do get that, yes, you likely can enable the Knight class with a whole bunch of others. And when I was talking earlier about a lot of these cards being great for Squall, you have the other Full Metal Alchemist card here. That's the crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent, where again, I'm leaning into this crit rate concept. This is an A+ card for that. You have another one here with the Reagan card. That's that slash res, crit damage, and chain res. All it would take is another like card or two for the Knight class, particularly when you look at who's in it, from Squall to Bradley to Wingstern. Lightning is going to get a nice bump in the Pixel Remaster whenever we get that. But there's some interesting combination and synergies there where you consider the other slashers that are in this class, with Squall's 38% AoE slashing peril. Now for the Esper Synergies, I kind of cheated ahead earlier. I would really focus on the modifiers here. Again, really trying to amplify that damage output. So primarily lightning attack and human killer, slash attack secondarily, where if you do have that Trick Lancer sub on, the slash attack won't apply to those pierce attacks. Attack percent is up there too as well, but I do like the crit rate and crit damage avenue as well if you can combine some of those. The matchup specifics really kind of a lower priority for me, at least for now. Now my recommendations, Master Coral is a great one for the lightning attack, and a few other nodes there. Sildra might be my favorite here, where Sildra's attack percent and 2 different nodes or 2 different branches of slash attack up. And then as I mentioned before, Dark Bahamut's another great one too, with the attack percent, the human killer, the slash attack, the crit damage, a whole bunch of good things. Now secondarily, I do like Aegon and Scorpion Sentinel here. Now Aegon in particular does have some excellent crit rate board nodes on there with lightning attack as well. Also has some pierce resistance, so talk about that negative 10%. That's probably the only matchup thing I might cautiously build him for. And Scorpion Sentinel is just a decent one for the extra lightning res, which we're seeing a bunch of at the moment. But even the regular Odin and Dark Odin are 2 excellent ones as well when you consider their potential offensive potency. Regular Odin in particular, because again, the human killer and the 2 slash attack trees. But realistically speaking, there's nothing wrong with going with Espers that have element res on them either. I just don't think he necessarily needs it quite yet because of the Esther Vision card and what that enables. Now for the weapon optimization, the Leonhart is an exceptionally good weapon for him. It's really the only one I recommend. It's another initial AP of 10, so you talk about AP management there. It's crit rate of 15, and upon that critical hit, which again, this keeps coming up, he'll generate 15 defense for himself, which yes, does stack with other buffs he might do. So for instance, his teammate buff that grants 20 defense will stack with this 15. And then it's got the slash stack 15 as well. I personally have built a crit rate of this weapon. I think 24 is enough. That little bit extra certainly helps. But it's a great weapon. And just covering the Ragnarok, which is the Trials of Reckoning equipment item here. Sorry, just cleaning up the visual a little bit here. Obviously like to see the extra 10% slash and strike res, where he already has 20% innately. His buff is another 25%. This is another 10%. So you're talking 55% res at minimum, all that included, not including the Honeycomb Barrier damage reduction. It's a very, very strong thing for what we're seeing. It's also the 20% physical damage increase, which is bigger than what the Genji Glove gives. And this is also the question marks here. That's the Honeycomb upgrade that we saw earlier, where he has his normal Honeycomb buff. This item, which will be in the Trial of Reckoning in a week or two, will enhance that Honeycomb Barrier. So I love this. I can't see many reasons why you would equip something else, unless it's just for the fact that we completely leave a strike and slash meta, which is not really something happening soon, or if you need something a little more niche for a different kind of matchup. But that's the Squall character review in a nutshell. There's honestly still a lot to like about this character. It's a very creative build they've gone for here in Global. I only think it's like a vision card or 2 away from him having a really good signature there with a few of those other Knight classes. I think he satisfies the itch for PvEers in terms of high scores with what he can potentially offer the lightning element that doesn't already exist. It may not age well at the time of this review because we're also getting the new Astrius character that was just announced today. But then again, that new Astrius character actually could be one who enhances Squall here from a mono lightning perspective. I know many people passed on Vega, but from what I can tell so far, this new lightning Astrius looks really interesting. But either way, hopefully this was insightful, informative, a little fun to watch me cosplay. This is kind of cool. Little budget cosplay here. This is like a Jon Snow costume that I had from years ago. Little makeup marker across here, and my hair just so happened to be the proper length that I think came out pretty good here. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll talk to y'all soon.